Samuel Brooks, a 75-year-old black veteran, sat quietly in a small, shadowed-corner booth of Maple Street Diner. Amid the lively chatter and clinking dishes, he seemed almost invisible, an island of silence in a sea of noise. His jacket, old but kept with pride, rested over his frail shoulders, and his hands, steady but weathered, wrapped around a cup of coffee, waiting to feel the warmth of his son's arrival. Every now and then, his gaze drifted toward the door, eyes both hopeful and weary. In a place buzzing with life, Samuel sat alone, looking somehow misplaced yet dignified, holding on to a quiet strength no one seemed to notice. Before we dive into this powerful story, make sure to subscribe so you never miss moments that reveal the true depths of human resilience and dignity. Then, the door to the diner swung open sharply, breaking the rhythm of the room. Two police officers, Officer Barnes and Officer Hayes, stepped inside, their presence casting an immediate chill. Their eyes scanned the tables, and within seconds they fixed on Samuel, sitting quietly by himself. Barnes leaned toward Hayes with a sly grin, murmuring something that made Hayes smirk in agreement. In a mostly white neighborhood, Samuel's quiet figure felt, to them, like an intrusion. Their smirks were laced with disdain as they made their way over, Barnes leading with a cold determination. Without a word of greeting, he stopped directly in front of Samuel, his gaze sharp, assessing, and wholly uninviting. Officer Barnes didn't waste a second. He looked Samuel up and down, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice hard, laced with suspicion. No greeting, no respect, just a blunt question, as if Samuel's very presence was an offense. Samuel looked up, meeting Barnes's eyes without a flicker of fear, just a calm strength that came from years of endurance. "I'm waiting for my son," Samuel replied, his voice unwavering. But his quiet dignity only seemed to make Barnes more impatient. Hayes, watching from behind, couldn't resist adding his own taunt, voice dripping with mockery. "You sure this is the place for you, old man? Don't usually see folks like you trying to blend in here." His smirk widened, pleased with his remark, but Samuel simply nodded slightly and repeated, "I'm just waiting for my son." His calm response, unshaken by their taunts, only fueled Barnes's frustration. He leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he demanded to see Samuel's ID, his tone anything but polite. It wasn't a request, it was a command, a challenge veiled in authority, aimed to undermine Samuel's dignity. Without hesitation, Samuel reached into his pocket, pulling out his veteran ID card. The card, worn from years of carrying, symbolized the sacrifices he had made for his country. He handed it to Barnes, his gaze steady. But Barnes barely glanced at it before letting out a sneer, tossing it back onto the table with a flick of his wrist. "A vet, huh? This old thing's probably fake," he muttered, barely containing his disdain. Hayes snickered, his voice low and taunting. "Really a vet? I'd think guys like you were just washing dishes back then, or maybe hauling supplies. Hard to imagine you did more than that." The weight of their words settled heavily in the air. But Samuel didn't flinch. He held his silence, his gaze steady, refusing to give them the reaction they wanted. Yet, their mockery continued, a cruel game designed to strip him of his dignity. The officers' taunts grew sharper, their contempt all too obvious. Barnes leaned in, voice dripping with mock authority. "You need to leave, old man. This isn't your place," he warned, making it clear that Samuel's presence was no longer tolerated. Samuel took a deep breath, still seated, and replied, "I'm waiting for my son. I have every right to be here, just like anyone else." His voice was calm, but the tension in the diner was now thick enough to cut through. Barnes's smirk faded, replaced by a scowl of irritation. "You think you can just sit here and talk back?" he spat. Hayes stepped closer, folding his arms as he looked down at Samuel with open disdain. "We don't see many people like you around here, and there's a reason for that," he muttered, his words a cruel jab aimed at Samuel's identity and history. Other diners had started to notice the confrontation. A few glanced over with a mix of curiosity and discomfort, but no one intervened. The lively chatter that once filled the diner had faded into an uneasy silence. But Samuel remained unmoved, his posture steady, his gaze calm. His quiet endurance, instead of defusing the officers, only seemed to inflame their egos further. Barnes leaned in even closer, his voice now barely above a whisper, but filled with malice. "I'm giving you one last chance to get up and leave, or we're taking you out ourselves." The officers' taunts grew sharper, their contempt all too obvious. Barnes leaned in, voice dripping with mock authority. "You need to leave, old man. This isn't your place," he warned, making it clear that Samuel's presence was no longer tolerated. Samuel took a deep breath, still seated, and replied, "I'm waiting for my son. I have every right to be here, just like anyone else." His voice was calm, but the tension in the diner was now thick enough to cut through. Barnes's smirk faded, replaced by a scowl of irritation. "You think you can just sit here and talk back?" he spat. Hayes stepped closer, folding his arms as he looked down at Samuel with open disdain. "We don't see many people like you around here, and there's a reason for that," he muttered, his words a cruel jab aimed at Samuel's identity and history. Other diners had started to notice the confrontation. A few glanced over with a mix of curiosity and discomfort, but no one intervened. The lively chatter that once filled the diner had faded into an uneasy silence, but Samuel remained unmoved, his posture steady, his gaze calm. His quiet endurance, instead of defusing the officers, only seemed to inflame their egos further. Barnes leaned in even closer, his voice now barely above a whisper, but filled with malice. "I'm giving you one last chance to get up and leave, or we're taking you out ourselves." The threat hung heavily in the air. Samuel simply looked up, his face expressionless yet resolute. The years had taught him not to react. His silence was a shield, one that Barnes and Hayes didn't understand, and their frustration only grew. Hayes crossed his arms tighter, glancing at the crowd who had grown quieter, their stares now fixed on the unfolding scene. Yet, despite the eyes watching, no one dared to intervene, and perhaps that emboldened the officers further. Barnes's voice lowered as he hissed, "People like you need to remember where you belong." The venom in his words was undeniable, but Samuel didn't flinch, refusing to give them the satisfaction. Samuel met Barnes's eyes, unshaken, his expression calm yet firm. "I'm not causing any trouble," he replied, his voice measured and dignified. "I'm simply a man waiting for his son." His words, though simple, carried a weight that even the officers couldn't ignore. For a brief moment, Barnes seemed taken aback, as if surprised that this quiet man would dare to assert his right to be there. But the flash of hesitation quickly faded from Barnes's face, replaced by a scowl. Hayes, standing slightly behind, muttered, "You think you can just sit here and ignore us?" His voice was laced with scorn, trying to goad Samuel into a reaction. Samuel's eyes didn't waver. "I've faced worse than this," he said softly, almost to himself. His gaze, though steady, carried the weight of years and experiences that neither officer could understand. Without warning, Barnes shoved Samuel's chair, knocking it back and forcing the elderly man to stand. The sudden movement startled everyone nearby, drawing gasps from other diners. Yet Barnes and Hayes didn't flinch. Their expressions were cold, almost mechanical. Barnes stepped forward, grabbing Samuel's shoulder roughly, while Hayes smirked, clearly enjoying the scene. "Let's make sure you're not hiding anything," Barnes sneered, his tone implying suspicion and accusation. Samuel raised his hands slightly, not in fear, but as a quiet compliance, showing he had nothing to hide. Barnes patted him down with unrestrained force, his actions rough and without a hint of respect. It was as if he wanted to strip Samuel of any last shred of dignity. Hayes, watching with crossed arms, spotted Samuel's faded veteran hat on the table. With a look of disdain, he picked it up, examined it briefly, then let it fall to the floor carelessly. The sight of his hat, a symbol of service and sacrifice, being tossed aside was enough to make Samuel's jaw tighten. Still, he refused to give them any reaction, maintaining his composure even as his heart pounded with indignation. Hayes sneered, "You don't deserve this," and stepped on the hat, grinding it under his boot. The other patrons watched in stunned silence, some of them shifting uncomfortably, but none moved to intervene. Samuel stood quietly amidst the humiliation, his steady gaze fixed forward, refusing to let them see the hurt they so desperately wanted to provoke. Not satisfied with the shame they had already inflicted, Barnes grabbed Samuel's walking cane, a sturdy, well-worn piece that had supported him for years. With a mocking glance at Hayes, he sneered, "Guess you won't be needing this anymore." And with a sudden, ruthless motion, he snapped the cane over his knee, breaking it into two jagged pieces. The sound of splintering would echo through the silent diner, a brutal reminder of how far these officers were willing to go. Samuel's hands trembled ever so slightly as he watched the cane fall to the floor in pieces, a symbol of his strength and independence shattered before him. But even as his heart pounded with a mix of sorrow and anger, he held himself steady, refusing to let them see the impact of their cruelty. The officer's smirks widened, sensing victory in his silence, as if his lack of reaction somehow justified their actions. With cold determination, Barnes grabbed Samuel's arm, twisting it behind his back with unnecessary force. Samuel grimaced, a flash of pain crossing his face, but he bit back any sound. Hayes chuckled, leaning in close enough for Samuel to hear. "Not so tough now, are you?" he whispered, his voice laced with contempt. Around them, the other diners were frozen in place, eyes wide with horror and disbelief. Some had their phones out, capturing the unfolding scene, but none dared intervene. The silence in the diner was thick, heavy with tension and quiet. Outrage. A few patrons looked away, unable to bear witness to the humiliation any longer, while others watched with grim faces, the reality of the scene settling over them like a dark cloud. Samuel, still held firmly by Barnes, cast his gaze downward, his face a mask of quiet endurance. This was not the first time he had faced such treatment, and in his mind, he knew it might not be the last. But even in his pain, he clung to the last remnants of his dignity, determined to outlast their cruelty. Just as Barnes prepared to tighten his grip, Samuel shifted his gaze, nodding slightly toward the table. "Look at the card on the table," he said softly, his voice calm despite the intensity of the moment. Barnes hesitated, glancing down at the small reservation card, the name written in bold letters catching his attention. "Commissioner James Brooks." In an instant, the color drained from Barnes's face, his confident smirk replaced by a look of pure shock. The words sank in slowly, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. This man they'd humiliated, belittled, and mocked was the father of their boss, the very commissioner who led their precinct. Hayes, peering over Barnes's shoulder, read the name and felt his stomach drop. Realization dawned on them both like a harsh, unforgiving light, exposing the depth of their mistake. Samuel stood there silently, his face a calm mask as he watched their expressions change from arrogance to fear. They stammered, words failing them as they scrambled for an excuse. Barnes's hands, which moments before had been rough and unrelenting, now loosened their grip on Samuel, releasing him as if he'd suddenly become untouchable. "Sir, we didn't know," Barnes mumbled, his voice barely a whisper, each word dripping with panic. The atmosphere in the diner shifted again, the weight of the officer's fear palpable. Some of the patrons, sensing the change, began to murmur among themselves, their expressions a mix of disbelief and quiet satisfaction. Phones were still recording, capturing every moment of the officer's sudden fall from power. The silence that had once signaled fear now became a quiet condemnation from everyone watching. Samuel said nothing, simply observing as Barnes and Hayes fumbled for an explanation. Their earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by pale faces and shaking hands. Barnes attempted to stutter out an apology, his voice trembling. "Sir, we had no idea. If we'd known you were the commissioner's father." But Samuel's face remained impassive, unyielding, as if their words held no meaning. He had no need for apologies. The name on the card spoke loudly enough. All the cruelty, the mocking words, and the violence, they couldn't be undone by a simple "sorry." Samuel understood that. Barnes and Hayes stood there, frozen, their faces pale and blank as the full weight of their actions settled over them. The quiet authority Samuel exuded, combined with the knowledge of who he was, seemed to strip them of any last remnant of pride. Their shoulders slumped, and any trace of arrogance had long since faded, replaced by a raw, unmistakable shame that they couldn't hide. As they stammered, each struggling to find the right words, the silence in the diner seemed to press down harder, amplifying their discomfort. Barnes finally managed to speak, his voice barely audible. "Sir, please, we didn't know. We were just following." But even he seemed to realize that no excuse could possibly justify what they'd done. Hayes, standing beside him, looked down at his feet, unable to meet Samuel's gaze. The confidence that had fueled their earlier taunts was now a distant memory, buried under the shame of their actions. Around them, the other diners continued to watch, some with their arms crossed, others with expressions of grim satisfaction. For those who had sat in stunned silence as the officers bullied Samuel, this moment felt like justice unfolding before their eyes. The phones remained held up, capturing the officers' visible shame for all to see, as if to ensure this would not be forgotten. Barnes attempted another apology, his voice trembling. "Mr. Brooks, we never meant..." But Samuel's unblinking gaze seemed to cut off his words, making it clear that no apology could erase what had happened. Barnes felt his throat tighten, realizing he had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. The gravity of his actions weighed heavily on him, like a burden he'd have to carry well beyond this diner. For Samuel, this moment wasn't about revenge, it was about dignity reclaimed. He didn't need to raise his voice or retaliate. The officer's shame was punishment enough. Standing tall, Samuel looked past them, his silence speaking louder than any words could. As the officers fumbled in shame, the door to Maple Street Diner swung open once more. A tall, commanding figure entered, Commissioner James Brooks, Samuel's son. His mere presence brought an immediate hush over the room. Patrons who had been watching the scene now looked to him, their expressions shifting from anger and disapproval toward the officers to something resembling hope. Here was someone who could finally bring justice to a situation that had gone too far. James took in the scene with a practiced eye, first noticing his father, standing with quiet dignity amid the shattered remains of his walking cane and his discarded veteran's hat on the floor. His heart ached at the sight, the stains on his father's clothes, the broken cane lying uselessly beside him. But Samuel's gaze was steady, unwavering, a look that said he had already made peace with what had happened. Even so, James could feel the rage bubbling just beneath his own calm exterior. Without a word to his father, James turned to the two officers, his expression unreadable but his authority unmistakable. Barnes and Hayes, already pale with regret, stiffened as they recognized the commissioner. Their faces turned even whiter, panic flashing in their eyes as they braced for what was to come. Barnes opened his mouth, perhaps to offer another feeble apology, but James silenced him with a single, piercing look. "Do you have any idea?" he began, his voice steady but laced with a barely controlled anger. "What you've just done?" Barnes and Hayes stammered, searching for words, but none came. They knew there was no excuse for what they'd done. James's gaze was unrelenting, his disappointment evident. "This man," he said, gesturing toward Samuel, "is not only my father but a veteran who has served this country with honor. And you've treated him with nothing but disrespect." The weight of James's words hit the officers hard, their faces a mix of fear and guilt. Hayes's gaze dropped to the floor, unable to meet the commissioner's eyes. Barnes looked as though he wanted to vanish, his earlier bravado now completely shattered. For a moment, the entire diner seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. James didn't raise his voice, but the intensity of his words carried a power that no yelling could match. "It doesn't matter who he is," he continued, his voice low but firm. "Every person deserves respect. Every single one." The officers stood silent, knowing they had crossed an unbreakable line. James's piercing gaze lingered on the two officers, who now stood ashen and defeated. With a calm but unyielding tone, he issued his decision. "Both of you will report to my office first thing tomorrow morning." he said, the weight of his authority unmistakable. "And expect disciplinary action. This will not be ignored." Barnes and Hayes nodded silently, their faces drained of any arrogance, replaced with pure regret. Without another word, James pointed toward the door, a silent command for them to leave. Humiliated, they turned and exited the diner, their steps heavy under the weight of what they had done. As the door closed behind the officers, a calm settled over the diner. James took a deep breath, then turned to his father, his stern expression softening. He stepped forward, reaching into his pocket for the handcuff key, and gently freed Samuel's wrists. The metal cuffs fell away, leaving faint red marks on his father's skin. James's face held a mixture of sorrow and respect as he took his father's hands in his own, steadying them with a tenderness that belied his earlier anger. "Dad, I'm so sorry for what you had to endure," James said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He knew that no words could truly erase the hurt Samuel had experienced, but he wanted his father to feel the sincerity of his apology. But Samuel, ever composed, simply placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. He looked up at James with pride, his eyes warm and steady. "You handled it well, son," he replied softly. In that brief exchange, they shared an unspoken understanding, a bond that needed no words, only mutual respect, love, and the quiet dignity that defined them both. News of the incident spread quickly throughout the town, igniting outrage in the community. Many were shocked that a man like Samuel, a veteran who had served with honor, could be treated so unjustly. The police department, under James's leadership, launched an investigation into the officer's actions. Both Barnes and Hayes faced immediate suspension, and they were required to attend mandatory training on respect and ethics, a step toward reshaping the department's values. For the residents, the incident became a stark reminder of the importance of dignity and respect. Conversations sparked across the town, urging people to look deeper at their own attitudes and behaviors. For Samuel, it was a painful experience, but one that brought a quiet sense of hope, that, perhaps, change was finally possible. In the days that followed, Samuel's quiet strength became a symbol of resilience for the community. His calm dignity in the face of cruelty reminded everyone of the power of self-respect and the importance of standing tall, even when treated unjustly. As James continued to enforce accountability within the department, his respect for his father grew deeper, knowing that Samuel's grace had paved the way for real change. For Samuel, the experience was a painful reminder of the battles he'd faced his whole life, yet he remained hopeful. He knew that every act of respect, every lesson in dignity, could build a stronger, fairer community. And in that quiet diner, surrounded by those who now understood his worth, Samuel found a small but significant victory. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more stories that shed light on the strength of the human spirit.